Miutinu, jau viskas eina į transliaciją. Eina ir į YouTube, eina ir į Zoomą. Dievo laiminiai, kurie turės pranešinėti, jie turi pirmiausia prisijungti. Zoomas paleistas. Uždėsim, praeitą kartą aš ten bandžiau
Hello. Hello.
Hi.
Hi. I'm sorry about
Hi.
this, obviously.
Sorry, we were having some technical issues. We will start in a minute. How are you, Arthur?
Well, relieved that I have it now. That we've made contact.
Yeah.
I have a PowerPoint.
Yes. So you should share the screen, and yeah, we will connect the moderator just in a minute.
And yeah, I am not a technical whiz. My PowerPoint
Yes.
is it, if I share, is it shared right now?
Yes. Oh no, I can see it now. There is a green button below you, below your face, or share screen.
Yeah, I think I hit shared screen.
Okay. O galit padėti jam pasišėrinti ekraną, bent jau instrukcijas kažkokias, nu?
So you need to press a button, share screen, green button, share screen, and you choose file, which file you want to share. First of all, you need to open this presentation, this file.
Okay, the PowerPoint is open.
So then press button share screen in Zoom, the green button in middle of Zoom.
Yes, I've
Press
done
and select the PowerPoint presentation.
Yes.
And press button share. Okay, we see it. Now you can make a full screen by pressing F5, I think, button.
Is it satisfactory as it is, or is it necessary to press full screen?
Better is full screen for presentation. View or in, I don't know. In keyboard is button F5, I think. Oh, it's MacBook. I don't know. Where is the in the bottom of right, more right, and view or this button. What this button? Below your. Okay, leave it. Just present. Thank you.
Very good. Okay. Apologies in advance for any technical difficulties. I chose Bruckner's Third Symphony because it's a personal favorite, but also because it is a work that intersects dynamically with several concert music stereotypes. We are all familiar with the story of the failed first performance, the premiere of the third in 1877 in Vienna under the inept direction of the composer ranks among the most mortifying fiascos in the annals of music history. Negative reviews, masterpieces we know are met with bewilderment by critics. The reception of the third was mostly negative, although there were some interesting flickers of light amid the darkness. In any case, the third divided the Viennese musical intelligentsia into factions for and against its composer, these corresponding more or less to the Wagner and Brahms camps. Unprecedented length. Everyone knows that Bruckner wrote symphonies on a monumental scale. The third in its original version is the longest, as reckoned by numbers of bars. Multiple versions, and the Bruckner problem. We understand that Bruckner's symphonies are complicated by variations. An exhaustive inventory of the Third Symphony variants would number more than a dozen. Wagner, we know Bruckner revered the master. He expressed this veneration explicitly in the third with a dedication which, as this image of the autograph indicates, he took quite seriously. It is also well known that the original version contains Wagner quotations, which make the Third Symphony a rich vein for the study of intertextuality, as well as its presumed antipode, creativity. I shall focus on this topic before turning my attention to the variants as a potential expression of creativity. The opening minutes of the third are commonly analyzed as an intertextual phenomenon. Mysterioso beginning is hard to imagine without the example of the corresponding passage in Beethoven's Ninth, also in D minor. The first few bars of each theme define a tonic minor triad in that key, a characteristic shared by the first few bars of the main theme of Wagner's Flying Dutchman. Yet the differences are almost as remarkable as the similarities. Beethoven begins with a sustained fifth that is established as the dominant in bar 15 by the sudden appearance of a D in the horns and bassoons, followed by a crashing downward unison theme in D minor. Bruckner creates a comparably uneasy atmosphere with 4 bars of restlessly pulsing strings in D minor before a trumpet confirms the key and climbs up the melodic minor scale in a manner that is unsettling in its simplicity. To adopt poetic imagery, Beethoven says, "Let there be light," defining the moment of creation with the tonic. Bruckner, taking his lead from Beethoven, starts his symphony after the moment of creation, while the molecules are rushing hither and thither, seeking a definite form. After a prolonged and suspenseful crescendo, Bruckner unleashes a powerful statement in unison, followed by a harmonization that finally adds materiality to the nebulous beginning. Let's hear how it goes. This is a YouTube excerpt with the score. I hit pause reluctantly. The continuations are likewise comparable but distinct. Beethoven restates the theme in the relative major. Bruckner moves instead to the dominant and restarts the process, creating a mirror image of Beethoven's plan. There are other links. Bruckner's first movement, like Beethoven's, ends with a powerful ostinato on a tonic pedal that leads to a terminal statement of the main theme. In Bruckner's finale, there is a catalog of themes that can hardly fail to remind us of Beethoven's catalog in the finale of the Ninth. This was suppressed in 1877. Did Bruckner have an aesthetic change of heart, or did he wish to avoid giving the impression that he compared himself to Beethoven? Possibly he simply wished to save time, although the episode lasts less than a minute. I cannot say that I subscribe to any one explanation. These explanations are, at any rate, not mutually exclusive. The important point is that the elements we identify as intertextually linked to Beethoven are coherently explained by their function in the structure of the work. Now, what about Wagner? We hear so much about these notorious quotations. Let's listen to one near the end of the Adagio. If I were present in Vilnius, I might ask for a show of hands or some guesses as to what is being referred to. I hope that it was audible, perhaps not visible. The steady descent after letter N is taken to be a reference to the sleep motive from Die Walküre, which was premiered only 3 years before. The resemblance is undeniable, as is the aesthetic propriety of the passage as a transition, in a harmonic sense, sequence of transitions from fortissimo climax to pianissimo repose. All quotations must have value in their context. This one is applied with an aptness that qualifies as ingenious. No knowledge of Wagner is needed to understand its function. It is interesting that in the 1877 version, Bruckner added a tremolo to the 4 bars following letter N, making the Adagio more referentially Wagnerian, while he was busy making the outer movements less so. Bruckner does present difficulties to those who seek to understand him. How do we assess this intertextual tapestry? Above all, how do we reconcile it with another concert music archetype that the third exemplifies, originality? Despite the parallels I have mentioned, Bruckner sounds like no other composer. The history of Bruckner reception is substantially the history of an astonished public confronting his otherness, his vast architecture and stark contrasts, and reacting with either fascination or dismay. And the Third Symphony is commonly cited as a breakthrough score, the first full expression of Bruckner's maturity. "30 years ago, Joseph Strauss, in Remaking the Past, identified three basic models of artistic influence. Influence as immaturity, influence as generosity, and influence as anxiety. The first has little relevance to Bruckner, who studied counterpoint methodically as a young man and produced examination works like the Study Symphony that do not sound much like anybody. Influence as anxiety denotes the approach associated with the literary critic Harold Bloom. Successful poets by this theory undertake strong misreadings of their precursors, an adversarial process that Bloom characterizes as a rebellion against a dead man outrageously more alive than himself. Strong misreading entails, quote, a triumphant wrestling with the greatest of the dead. The theory has enjoyed popularity among music scholars. It works for Arnold Schoenberg. It seems an odd fit for Bruckner, however, given the reverential nature of his relations with Wagner and posthumously Beethoven. Incidentally, Bruckner insisted on being present for the reinterment of Beethoven's remains in 1888. Perhaps influence as anxiety could be crossbred successfully with influence as generosity, the theory associated with T.S. Eliot. According to Eliot, susceptibility to influence is a sign of understanding, not incapacity. Artists are mature when they acquire a perception not only of the pastness of the past, but its presence, and a sense of the timeless and temporal together. This deserves much more exploration, but I wish now to consider some implications of the revisions of the third. As I mentioned, there are many variants, but the fundamental texts are the Novak editions identified with the years 1873, 1877, and 1889. All three carry Bruckner's imprimatur, although there are allegations of external interference with the last of these. The changes are almost all in the direction of greater economy. The 2,046 bars of the first version is reduced to 1,644 by 1889, a difference that can be appreciated by the duration of Georg Tintner's recording of the 1873 version, which lasts more than 77 minutes, and Marek Janowski's recording of 1889, which clocks in at less than 54. The cuts, which include the amputation of the finale of the first subject of the recapitulation, have traditionally been explained as accommodations and compromises Bruckner agreed to in the interest of having the symphony performed. Robert Simpson was sharply critical of the third in its revised forms and threw his weight behind the original version when Novak's edition became available. In fact, he reissued The Essence of Bruckner, that famous text, in a new edition because of the new version of the third. Conductors in general have followed his lead. 4 years ago, I heard Herbert Blomstedt and the Berlin Philharmonic lead the Berlin Philharmonic through the original version from memory at age 90. There is hope for us all. Preference for the long and difficult original version might be taken as evidence of greater sophistication, but scholars have resisted this trend, viewing Bruckner's compression and excisions as valid experiments with sonata deformation and sonata failure. Dermot Galt's volume, The New Bruckner, can be taken as representative of this outlook. There has even been an attempt to treat the corrupt editions of Franz Schalk and Ferdinand Loewe, anathema to generations of Brucknerians, as objects of legitimate study with freestanding aesthetic value. One paradox this line of thinking presents us with is the possibility of viewing destruction as a creative act. I have not yet developed a coherent response to the Bruckner problem after some years of considering it. Possibly the solution is not to seek one, but rather to appropriate a contemporary cliche and affirm that Bruckner's diversity is his strength. Undoubtedly, his self-editing was at least partly the result of the influence of others and the belief that a more compact score was more likely to be accepted for performance. But this does not preclude the possibility that he sometimes viewed destruction and reconstruction as a function of the creative process. The Costa Rica-based scholar Gabriel Ignacio Venegas Caro argues in a 2017 dissertation written at the University of Arizona that the Bruckner problem should be recast as the Bruckner potential. Since the gradually reinforced sonata failure trajectory of the adagio of the third is contingent upon compositional reworking, he writes, we may as well take Bruckner's penchant for revision, often cast in a negative light as his weakness, and construe it as one of his foremost acts of self-determination. It is an interesting means of bringing new vitality to the Bruckner debate, and possibly for some of us, welcome peace of mind. And here's an excerpt from this dissertation, which I obviously recommend. It changed my thinking about Bruckner, and that is saying something. So thanks very much for your attention. I hope I came over clearly, and I hope the music was audible.
Good morning, Arthur. Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. I was very pleased to see a presentation on tonal music because, to be honest, I found some common principles of thinking between the past and today's. But before making a statement, I would like to ask if there are any questions or thoughts to be shared between the participants and the audience. Yes, please, Ellen.
Hello, Arthur. Maybe, yeah, here I am. So,
Hello.
okay, so my question is, because you're talking about the management of influence in Bruckner's music, and I'm no expert in Bruckner's myself, so I'm wondering if there are any of his own words or of his own accounts that he has spoken or written about. Obviously, we don't know if he's spoken about, if he's written anything about how he managed influence, and if at all it's conscious, perhaps, or unconscious.
This is an excellent question, and unfortunately, I find that Bruckner's letters and records are often very deferential and polite and not particularly revealing. We don't have what we have for Brahms, for example, the famous comment that any jackass can see that at once, when he was mentioned to him that his first symphony choral finale resembled the finale of Beethoven's Ninth, the Ode to Joy theme. We don't have anything like that from Bruckner. So I'm afraid I don't have a ready answer to you. I think that Bruckner is somebody we've always struggled to understand, partly because of the mythology surrounding his simple nature, his peasant-like attributes, his devout Roman Catholicism, all of which are valid constructs, but tend to obliterate the possibility of independent thought. So I don't have any textual material, any words from him regarding his relation to other composers. Although the anecdote is well known concerning the third, I gave you, I put on the screen the initial page of the autograph of the 1873. There's a story very well documented by multiple sources of Bruckner visiting Wagner in Bayreuth with autographs of the Second Symphony and the Third with the intention of asking him which one he would like to have dedicated to him. And we know what the answer was, although Bruckner himself apparently was confused as to what the answer was because he got drunk during the episode. So there are these interesting anecdotes, but I'm not aware of much documentary evidence about what Bruckner himself thought about other composers. Although, as I say, it's interesting that he insisted on being present for the reinterment of Beethoven's remains in the Central Cemetery in 1888, and he held Beethoven's skull. So there's no question of his reverence of the past, but I'm afraid that how he regarded his own assimilation of the past is an open matter.
Arthur, thank you.
Okay.
Okay. Is there any other question for today? The statement, Arthur, that I want to make it that every time I study or I see presented tonal music, I always find some stable principles that are still alive today in contemporary compositional thinking, like the treatment of tension and release, which is, let's say, a big issue for every composer, regardless the style or the era that we are talking about. So I see many common things between the past and today's composition about that.
And it's an interesting comment because Bruckner, while there's no composer who stood by the value of functional harmony more explicitly than Bruckner, is still regarded by many as modern. And the elements of his modernity have to do with scale, with unprecedented length, and with the architectonic construction of symphonies in parts, not necessarily held together by conversational tissue, if I may put it that way. So Bruckner's modernity might sound paradoxical for someone of his upbringing and firm affirmation of tonality, but it is certainly much discussed.
Exactly, yeah.
And the original versions are thought to be more modern by many conductors.
Yeah, I agree.
Kent Nagano, in his memoir, said that he thinks Bruckner was frightened by his own modernity, which was why he returned to the scores repeatedly, in this case with the intention of reducing and simplifying.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you very much. I think we're okay.
I'd like to jump in with this question of tension and release, which is really probably the basic mode of experiencing music. Whatever else we experience while listening to music, it is always accompanied by the feeling of increasing tension and decreasing. So I was wondering, about Bruckner, there seems to be really impossible to get something like large-scale tension and release with such dimensions and with so many waves, ups and downs and things like that. And perhaps that's one of the aspects of his modernity, because I believe that music, the subsequent development of music, didn't favor so much this large-scale tension release patterns like you have in sonata form. What would be your thoughts on that?
Well, Bruckner's experiments with sonata form, to me, involve extension, and the exposition of in the first group of the third is almost invariably tense to me. That that lengthy crescendo leading to the unison statement and then the harmonization. I don't think I'm answering your question, Miloš, though. What is the...
Talking about large-scale tension, the idea of this late 18th century sonata form would be, you reach the high point of tension with establishing the rival key, and then it's all about resolving it towards the end. I don't think that Bruckner really functions that way.
You interpret it more...
Even though it is nominally a sonata form, you can analyze it according to some textbook sonata rules. It does make some sense, but fundamentally it works differently from, let's say, an late 18th century sonata. Yeah,
I agree with you. Although the Brahms never abandoned sonata form, and the introduction of the third group is something that I see as being preceded by Schubert in many cases anyway. But with Bruckner, there's this expansion, and yes, he can be interpreted as an exponent of waveform. And there's a vital debate concerning, as I mentioned before, to what extent you can explain his music as sonata failure theory. So I think Bruckner studies, there is a Bruckner nation out there, and they might be a little bit inward looking, but there's a lot of vitality in Bruckner studies. And even to some extent now, a reaction against the reaction, I've noticed. But I think at least we certainly agree that Bruckner is an original.
Yeah, in a specific way, really unrepeatable. I can compare Bruckner to anyone else, actually. That's true. And then, I mean, it's fine. I don't see many papers dealing with Bruckner. When you have a look at his various conferences and publications, it's not really a favorite among music theorists and analysts.
It is among the Brucknerians.
It is among, yeah.
As I say, there is a nation out there, and they're not going away. And I think the works themselves, the public acceptance of Bruckner has gradually increased, and it's no longer considered a taxing night out to go and hear the Seventh Symphony or even the third in its original version. I think the notion that Bruckner is difficult is behind us. However, the notion that he is modern is not behind us.
That's okay. Thank you very much, all of you, for sharing so interesting thoughts. I think we are ready to welcome Viltė Žakevičiūtė, who is going to make a presentation which focuses on creativity as a key of success for an artist, with his or her creative mind being revealed in terms of structure, texture, expression, and making a particular decision while composing. Viltė is currently studying her doctorate studies at the Lithuanian Academy of Music and Theatre. She's exploring a theoretical study about the musical texture of Lithuanian composers of the 20th century, and her works feature musical tokens presenting different epochs and are meant to convey the subtle and personal existential experience.
Hello.
Viltė, welcome.
Yes, good morning. Thank you for the introduction. I hope you can hear me well. So it's an honor to be here, of course, and I'm pleased to have this opportunity to participate in this beautiful conference. And well, I would like to start and present my paper. So, okay, I will. Okay. Mhm. Okay. So first of all, I think that creativity is the key to success of an artist. It is essential while striving for originality and authenticity. Nevertheless, we have to cope with the question, is it possible for the contemporary artist to be original and unique nowadays? Especially when, as Adam Harper once said, modernity is the challenge of the infinite within the capacities of the present. This paper aims to discuss the phenomenon of creativity nowadays from the composer's point of view. Moreover, it is important to reveal the problem of freedom of choice and discuss the impact our creativity could have on composing music and making particular decisions. We can imagine that being unique and up-to-date is determined by composers' decisions to creatively use different patterns in musical structure and choose a particular aesthetics in composing music. When we try to ponder upon our recent past retrospectively and think about the 20th century, the issue of the dominance of musical texture expression as a principle of structuring remains particularly significant for the composers of the 21st century. Regarding Adam Harper, to find a more reasonable fundamental creative condition of composition, we need to look for a possibility to express the power while manipulating the sound by grasping the specific attributes of any sound based on how it varies. The result, unique expression of musical texture. So it is essential to notice that musical texture could be the main factor of creativity in music composition. According to David Harron, it is possible to imagine music without harmony, but it is difficult to imagine sound and music which would be devoid of texture. Due to the complicated and nerve-wracking decision-making process, the composer's creative mind is being revealed. Thinking about creativity and freedom of choice in music composition sometimes seems vacuous. We can have endless solutions while composing music. We can choose from an indefinite number of events of things to use in our musical piece and arrange them as we think is the best at the time. But it seems that actual creation begins when we reject all unnecessary choices and define them. In other words, when we limit ourselves. I believe this process is complicated for everyone, but in its way, because we have a lot of different possibilities. There are many of them, and it's not easy to imagine the result of our creative process. I mean, we can barely predict the end result. On the other hand, there will always be doubts about whether you made the right choice or if you could have chosen a completely different one. And then the fulfillment of the expectation would come to your mind. This is a paradox, but creativity is strongly associated with the limitations of your choices and possibilities. Creativity is self-limitation. When it comes to creativity in music composition, the question arises where to look for that, how to measure it, how to understand the process of creativity in music composing. And the main idea, I think, is to look at the musical texture. The musical texture is a phenomenon that has received many interpretations. That is why the perception of it became a problem. The musical texture could be understood as an image of a structure of the work as well. By examining the texture of a piece of music, it is possible to determine how the composer created his work and how it changes and develops over musical time. A wide range of extramusical means can be chosen to explore the phenomenon of musical texture. For example, we can imagine a piece of music as a picture, drawing, or painting, painted using different techniques such as watercolors, ink, oil paint, and so on. Musical texture can also resemble graphic scores and realistically represents them visually. Due to the visuality of the musical texture, it can be treated as a sounding musical fabric in which all codes are revealed. Because of that, we can understand and see how the work was created and why it is so unique. It depends on choosing means. The means we choose determine the appropriate musical texture. Nevertheless, the issue of musical texture remains problematic not only because of various interpretations in identifying the particular type of musical texture, but also because of questions about musical texture as a means of constructing a musical work. While looking for answers to the question of the expression of musical texture, it is helpful to notice the interactions between the phenomena and music. In the practice of music analysis, such phenomena can be called vertical and horizontal because they seem to be most apparent when the vertical is understood as a harmonic field of a music piece and the horizontal as a melodic field. Of course, we must mention the diagonal, like the one that connects vertical and horizontal. The correlation between vertical and horizontal sides could be understood and evaluated as an expression of a particular compositional pattern, of course, to keep in mind a diagonal in music. Thus, we can say that constructing musical texture is the highest level of creativity. While thinking about the musical texture, I came across the book. It's called Infinite Music. Imagine the Next Millennium of Human Music Making, written by musicologist and composer Adam Harper. I mentioned him before. It was interesting to notice his thoughts, which seem very appropriate to me regarding the musical texture. He introduces the concept of music variables. Harper borrows this concept from the mathematical sciences and relies on several dictionaries to justify his choice. The Cambridge Dictionary of Statistics describes a variable as some characteristic that differ from subject to subject or from time to time. However, he mentioned another dictionary that is slightly more specific, but as he said, no more or less correct, defining a variable as a quantity or characteristic that can take on different values. Combining these two interpretations, he also concludes his summary explanation by saying that, quote starts, a variable describes one single way in which the attributes of something can vary, and that variation is a variation in measurable values, quote ends. If we agree that music is a complex system of variables relating primarily to the production of sound, vertical, horizontal, and diagonal in music are particularly significant principles that shape music texture and can be structured by different musical variables. For instance, Harper, arguing that music is a system of variables and calls it music space, which situates the limitations of anyone, a particular idea or set of ideas about musical forms against a space of infinite variability expressed in infinite dimensions. Hence, the allusion to the infinity of choices is potentially aided by the illusion of a piece of music as a space-time of music, in which the composer has infinite resources for a variety of solutions. Because of that, regarding Harper, music should be treated as a process of continuously changing information. While trying to see everything more philosophically from an infinite perspective, we should say that music, which manifests as an event, is always unrepeatable and different, changed unless we restrict the perception of this change in some way, but of course until we create the system which can manage musical time. So we can say that time and time management processes in music, in addition to the principles of horizontal, vertical, and diagonal, are also important for the formation of expression of musical texture. So the question is how to choose the right choices. It is an open question, I guess. We can say that musical texture potentially becomes a reflection of the structure of the musical piece and becomes the expression of creativity. The structural units from which the musical texture is formed are fixed in work, sounds, and various aspects of their expression. The structural units of musical texture can be subjectively very diverse in both quantitative and qualitative terms. For example, how many musical structures are in the texture? It's like quantitative significance, or what quality expresses sound, such as loud or quiet, high or low. It's like qualitative significance. So this is observed that the musical texture is identified with the criteria of quantity and quality. However, the process in the musical work is important, especially in terms of musical time. Wallace Berry, talking about musical texture as space, says that there are many examples that can show texture in its spatial dimension and indicate particular textural dispositions of very distinctive, even motivic forms. He argues that the spatial factor, or as he calls it, texture space, might be defined as the field enclosed by lines, for example, tracing the pitch successions of outer components in addition to the two vertical or diagonal lines linking these components at left-right extremities at some given level of structure. If we agree that creativity is self-limitation, it is interesting to look at Harper's suggestion to think about the term degrees of freedom while talking about composers' opportunity to make the right decisions. Harper suggests the term in such context, which I think is very useful and pretty understandable. He borrows this quite technical term from science, engineering, and statistics. Actually, we can find a lot of different explanations of this term in various dictionaries. But for example, in statistics, degrees of freedom refer to the maximum number of logically independent values, which are values that have the freedom to vary. Merriam-Webster dictionary explains that the degree of freedom is one of the capabilities of a statistic for variation, of which there are as many as the number of unrestricted and independent variables determining its value. According to Harper, when describing a musical object, the higher the number of degrees of freedom we can observe, the narrower the ranges and constraints on what we can know are, and the more specific the information we know about the musical object becomes. On the other hand, when composing musical objects, higher degrees of freedom offer more significant opportunities for the specification of musical information. This allows, as Harper said, to think of musical knowledge in the abstract without having to separate the gathering of information from a context of open creative possibility. So we can think that as the number of degrees of freedom increases and the detail of compositional control increases, flexible musical objects become more concrete. Eventually, the number of degrees of freedom reaches some limit, which could be the number of degrees of freedom in a describing system such as a computer or the ultimate describing system, the universe itself. Thus, the idea of a progressive specification of musical objects tells us that there is a point at which the composer's degrees of freedom end and where other degrees of freedom pertain. We can theoretically sketch a line halfway along with the progressive specification that shows the cutoff point where the composer's degrees of freedom end and those that are even more specific start. For example, thinking about performers, musicians, those who would bring the musical work to life. Regarding Harper, more specific degrees of freedom starts, for instance, at the point of the performance musicians, and we can usually see it practically. For example, many constrained variables in a musical score have their values assigned by the composer, and still, in a performance of that musical work, many other degrees of freedom specify that particular performance beyond the domain of the composer's control over values. Those degrees of freedom that come after the composers are the domain of the performance and other participants, but are ultimately the domain of the universe itself. As Harper said, we can't step into the same universe twice. Like the river, its degrees of freedom constantly change its values. So composers are only partially responsible for their music-specific attributes. The real musician is the universe itself. But composers can choose to place themselves and their music at any point along with the progressive specifications of music, writing basic, maybe more flexible music, or highly specified, more creative, more concrete music. Theoretically, if the composer's freedom is infinite, corresponding to the pure, unconstrained variability of music space itself, then the amount of prior constraining information a describer has is zero. If the describers have all the specific information about a musical object, meaning that all its degrees of freedom bear specific information and the musical object is concrete, the composers and by extension the performers and participants have zero freedom. So composers and describers meet each other midway, along with the progressive specification of music. Well, there is no question that the decisions made by the composers determine the principles in the particular music piece and determine the musical texture of the work. So it depends on how much the composer limits himself or herself. What are their degrees of freedom? If we think, for example, about the composer Rytis Mažulis, his music has a lot of structural restrictions. The structuring of his works is strictly defined by one choosing principle that determines the form of the work. For example, we can think about one of his works, Clavier for Pure Reason, for virtual piano. The principle of canon as construction of diagonality is noticeable in its musical texture. As shown in the example, successive voices create an impression of diagonality, primarily visually. Here, diagonality is also not just a principle of making a musical texture, but because of the canon, this is also the principle of the whole creative idea of the work. Another example could be the composer Žibuoklė Martinaitytė and her music. Her compositions are rich in examples of multi-layered textures. One of them is the Sielon Maisimo for cello and string orchestra. At first glance, there is a slight change in the horizontality of the work, which could be identified as dominant. Still, a closer look reveals that more significant musical events occur in the vertical of the work. A more pronounced rhythmic figures appears in the violin and viola part, overlapping in the first strong part of the beat. When we look at the accented sounds of violin, viola, cello, and double bass, it appears with a delay. It creates recognition of a significant rhythmic musical gesture in the vertical line of musical texture. It can be immediately assumed that in the model of multi-layered texture, more significant musical events are likely to take place in the vertical of the piece because of the multi-layered texture, we can say, in itself dictates a relatively dense expression of musical material. As in a multi-layered model, layers may comprise either lines or entire musical structures characterized by timbre, style, metrical structure, rate of activity, or other factors. So horizontally manifested principles of music making manner, possibly different, overlaps with each other. So it is crucial to notice what is going on in the vertical line at that time. That was her creative idea. So to summarize, the phenomenon of creativity in composing music is a fascinating subject. We can say that the perception of creativity is a never-ending process, and every composer perceives this process differently. Today I mentioned two important terms that correlate with each other: music variables and degrees of freedom. In today's talk, these terms are more like guidelines that could help us understand the phenomena of creativity and expand our thinking about it. Talking about creativity, musical texture is important here because it can help structure the form of the musical work, and because all known musical parameters, such as harmony, pitch, timbre, rhythm, dynamics, and so on, are used to structure and create a musical texture. All these musical parameters can be called musical variables as well. Their specific appearances in the musical texture can help to notice the basic principles of structuring the work. So musical variables can be the impulse for creativity and means of our degrees of freedom. It can unlock new perceptions about the musical texture nowadays. So it helps to question how a recent phenomenon of musical texture could be understood in the way of creativity, in the never-ending process of choices. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Viltė, for this so interesting presentation on musical texture and the freedom of the composer, which is one of the great issues for every music creator. Is there any questions from the participants or the audience? Yes, please.
So thank you, Viltė, for your very interesting presentation. It was a pleasure to listen. I have a question about your own compositional practice. In which stage of creating process you yourself become aware of the texture of your piece? Or is it a starting point of the composition, or it develops during the creative ideas becoming to you?
Yes, thank you very much for the question. It's an interesting one and important one as well. Well, actually, every time the start of all that creative process for me is very different. And it's like a different adventure every time. That's why it fascinates me very much. But, well, actually, when I start to create something, I'm not thinking about the texture. So I'm just thinking about more basic things. But as I said, every time it's very different. And for all of us, I think at first we have an idea, and then we are trying to find just to find things, how to make it possible. And I think that talking about creativity nowadays, it's really important because we have a lot of different examples from various composers, and sometimes we have to pull ourselves together and then try to find more unique way of creating something, because we have a lot of to choose from, and sometimes it's a question about originality and even individuality of ourselves. So, well, for me, every time it's very different, and creative process itself is very nice experience and very interesting one. So yes.
So thank you very much for the thought sharing. If there are not any other questions, I think we are ready to invite Agne Mazulene, who is going to talk about the aesthetic, cultural, cognitive and personal factors which affect particular decisions while composing. She's going to examine patterns of compositional thinking based both on her own compositional language and on Clementi, Mazzulli and Cabelli musical ideas through interviews which highlight values, features and limits of an artistic ideological identity. I have to say that Agne is currently studying for her diploma in art at the Lithuanian Academy of Music and Theatre, where they previously accomplished her bachelor's and master's degree in musical composition. She is active in the Lithuanian compositional field, and her works are performed by professional ensembles such as Musica Humana, Junior Percussion, Jana Musica Choir, Miloš Vocal Ensemble, as well as St. Christopher Chamber Orchestra. Her creative work explores the potential of figure-eight composition, which is linked to diverse compositional methods. So, just a moment, please. So, Agne, welcome, and thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you. Good morning, dear participants in this hall and listeners online. I should maybe press F5, yes? No? And, Kodėl? Kas čia yra? Yes, so now it works. I'm very pleased to be part of this conference, which has already become a firm tradition of Lithuanian scientific culture. My today's topic is figure-eight music composition, the phenomenon which is the object and inspiration of my artistic research. Analyzing the musical compositions of various styles and techniques sometimes arises a question: what lies beyond the particular choices of the composer? What factors influence individual modus operandi? Going deeper into this problem, we see that creative style and decisions are influenced by various factors. For example, the case of Yanis Xenakis proves the importance of education. In John Cage's art and writings, we notice the echoes of Oriental aesthetics. Moreover, sometimes the composers start to blend various fields of knowledge and give birth to a whole new compositional philosophies, such as spectralism. Some composers shall even admit that the requirements of the contract and performance abilities make strong impact to their compositional decisions. In today's presentation, let us explore a very special type of compositional thinking in my artistic research named figurate music composition. This term arises from the similarities found between this phenomenon and Carmen figuratum, figurate poetry principles. The essential feature of both fields is the use of visual abstraction, in which the sign thing is visual, while the source thing is either non-visual or visual. According to Ulrich Ernst, who was the first to describe figurate poetry as an independent type, Carmen figuratum is distinguished by lyrical text, which is written in a certain associative visual form, fulfilling the mimetic, symbolic, and sometimes enigmatic functions. Consequently, in the figurate poetry, the object of abstraction is the idea of the text, while in figurate score, the structure of the piece. Let us examine it further. When we see a pictorial score, from the first glance, it is difficult to identify the purpose or the function of the visual layering. In other words, why the composer have chosen to curve the stuff into the form of a heart, triangle, circle, and so on. On the left side, we see Cordia's famous ballad, Belle Bon Sage. Those heart-shaped score is a visual abstraction of the romantic poem about the beloved lady. This case of notation is known as Augenmusik, but it is not figurate composition. It indeed looks attractive and playful, but in case of figurate score, beyond the decorative visual representation must be hidden much more complex decisions, revealing the fundamental compositional organization. It stands for a creative approach that the score functions as the structural code of the composition. As an early example of figurate tradition serves motet Extra Quam Bonum by Renaissance composer Ulrich Bretet. This score is a complex, strictly organized structure. In 3 concentric staves, 8 voices are arranged in the way that when the voices of inner and outer circles finish their parts, they pass to the middle circle, and all 8 form an infinite canon. In this case, figurate score is so well considered that it could be presumed that the proportions of the piece are equally influenced by both musical and visual parameters, which unite the notational elements into the complete, visually and musically rational work. So what forces the composer to restrict their creative freedom to algorithmic, complex visual structures? Trying to answer this question, I will lean upon the thoughts and creative examples of the composers devoted to figurate composition, namely Aldo Clementi, Rytis Mažulis, and Ričardas Kabelis. The first feature of figurate music composition as an ideology is the influence of riddle aesthetics. Those roots reach the late medieval religious and secular culture. Among the educated people, allegories and symbols were not only the attributes of religion, but also sort of intellectual entertainment. The composers complicated the musical text on purpose to encourage the performer and listener to take part in the intellectual challenge. Katilinė Šilts called this strategy obfuscatio resolutia, darkening and revealing principle. For example, it took more than 400 years to solve the musical riddle of Giselin Dankert's motet Ave Maristella. Only in the late 19th century, Hans Westgeist found out that this chessboard-shaped motet has 20 ways of performing, and all of them were foreseen by the composer. Nowadays, the art of compositional riddles is almost extincted, but the characteristic features of it, reductivity, orderliness, abstractedness, symmetry, and the aesthetics of mathematical beauty as the creative framework remains in use. The characteristic example revealing how the composers use strict visual parameters to create musical structure is Rytis Mažulis' work A Dazzled Eye Lost Its Speech for 4 even voices. It is written in 1985. It was the first of many subsequent figurate compositions by this composer. Explaining the creative process of this piece, Mažulis recalls that the discovering of figurate score was the sort of enlightenment, a proof that notation itself could dictate the solution of the musical form and liberate compositional process from chaotic experimentation. The composer admits that in the beginning of compositional practice, the notation was a thing not worthy to think about at all, but later it became one of the most important parameters, often predetermining the structure, form, and developmental principles of the piece. The Dazzled Eye is an infinite canon per tonos, for 4 even voices. The text is based on Stanisław Grochowek haiku, translated in Lithuanian by Sigitas Geda. Loose translation of it in English is, the dazzled eye lost its speech, a small ant with thin legs rolled it round the globe. The vocal text symbolically predetermined the choice of the staff layering. The composer recalls that the score, forming the infinite number 8, is inspired by the picture of Maurice Cornel Escher depicting the ants crawling on the Möbius stripe. It is interesting that the piece is not the only appearance of Möbius strip in Mažulis' creative work. In 1987, 2 years after The Dazzled Eye, he composed a piece called Möbius strip canon for violin and piano. Returning to A Dazzled Eye, the shape of the stave positions is not simply a decorative solution. It is predetermined by strict vertical arrangement of voices. The voices enter one after another in the middle section, then goes to the lower loop of the figure, back to the center, and then to the upper part, just as we write number 8, until finally returns to the beginning. Let us listen to the excerpt of this piece. Listening to this piece, we can clearly hear the changes of canonic entrances of voices. Let us go further. The similar case of vertical voice arrangement could be found in Aldo Clementi piece Aus Tiefer for female choir, winds, and organ. All 19 parts of this 30-minute work represents individual arrangement of voices, their temporal relation marked by vertical lines. The musical material is very ascetic. There are only 2 melodic motifs and their inversions and transpositions. This example witnesses that the composer, wishing to create one-page figurate score, must restrict himself to a very limited amount of musical material and their logical permutations. This choice echoes the Clementi's aesthetic views. It is true, art and music are dying of saturation. Therefore, either one has the courage to be silent or can continue to do things that express the agony and the dissolution of the represented object. To sum up these observations that trust on the symmetrical, pure visual structures as the basis of the compositional strategy appears to be one of the main aspects of figure-8 compositional principles. Another important aspect of this phenomenon is the special attention to symbolic meaning of visual and musical content. It is witnessed by Ričardas Kabelės work, The Confirmation of Myth, for 2 pianos. First piano part is printed in black and second in red. The red arrow near the center marks the beginning of the piece. After finishing the central circle, all subsequent circles should be played one after another. At the end of the outer circle, the players switch their parts and read the score in the opposite direction. The pitch structure of this piece is based on 3 chords: Tristan chord by Wagner, Prometheus chord by Scriabin, and Juseliūnas chord, corresponding to Western, Eastern, and Baltic professional music traditions. According to the author, the figural score, in the form of musicographic integral, reminds of the log of the universe, its key not existent. Speaking about his compositional preferences more generally, Kabelės asks rhetorically, on what else, if not on the rational laws of reality, could the structure of music be based? He admits that in the sketches or in mind always exists the idea of the figure, but sometimes, due to the lack of the time, it waits for its realization for even several decades. Moreover, Kabelės is faithful to the idea of integral composition. He appreciates the importance of interrelation between the musical and visual spheres. The process in which the musical and visual parameters influence each other, I consider as an aim of integral composing. The integral score must render the structure of the piece in a clear and simple manner based on the geometrical universalities. Looking at Kabelės works, we could notice that the notation is not only the tool to perform the music in the most ordinary way, but it also fulfills a function of structural basis, which means that the visual and musical parameters are related by the same principles. Let us listen to the excerpt of The Confirmation of Myth recording. Let us come back. So, as a composer, I also work at the field of figure-8 composition. It attracted me for countless possibilities of inner logic, such as in chess game, and its surprising results, developing the interaction of audible and visual parameters. As a practical example, I would like to show my composition for string orchestra volumen, the Latin word for a spiral. This title helps to understand the structure and visualizes the idea of the piece. To curve a staff into the spiral was not merely a decorative decision. The inspiration for the piece was a scroll of string instruments. Its elegant shape, starting from the Cremona luthers, has always represented the mastery of the creator. Even though the shape of the scroll does not influence the sound of an instrument, it, just like the other parts, is made putting great importance to the proportions. According to the old tradition, the scroll is a spiral made of 11 logarithmic segments with certain proportions. Why these particular proportions was chosen remains a secret. My creative experiment was to unwind the scroll and let the proportions of it become real sounds, following the acoustical principles of playing the string instruments. On the slide, we see the result of calculations I made for E string, and the same principle was adapted to the remaining strings. After obtaining the harmony, I applied the same principle to the time division. All of these line segments are the separate notes. Each of them repeats 11 times, using the same proportions in fractal principle. The result is a spiral structure, which is both structural and symbolic. What is the key to read this figure-8 score? The Arabian numbers refer to the time division marking the changes of the pitch, and the Romanian numbers, the detailed time divisions for the tone repetition. For me, it was quite a challenge to put all the orchestra piece in one page, and for me, it may be it's in the phase of the solving a riddle. As a result, the first violin begins from the first Arabian, the second violin, second Romanian, second Arabian, and so on. Everyone holds the initial pitch for every quarter of the spiral. In conclusion, figure-eight composition's ideological identity is formed by the discussed features: figure-eight poetry, riddle aesthetics, mathematical qualities of creative framework, and its symbolic content. Combining these aspects with their individual searching of musical meaning, figure-eight composition reveals a very special type of compositional thinking. It is based on the geometrical prototypes and generative compositional methods, resulting in the integrity of compositional structure and its visual representation. The score, becoming a structural code, is no longer the tool to write and restore musical information in the simplest way, but represents the essence of the composition, both structural and symbolic. Thanks for your attention, and now I'm open to questions.
Thank you, Agnes, so much. Are there any thoughts to be shared or questions? Yes, please.
Thank you for interesting sketches. My question, what about intuition in your figuration conception?
Thank you for the question. In my opinion, it's almost sacred question because every composer, it's very difficult to find out and explain why you make the particular choices in compositional principle. And it's not the case that the composer just decide to put this shape with this sounds and it works and everyone is happy. It requires many experimentational process and many changes. Just as Kabeli said, it is two important factors combined. One is the intuition and another is structural base. Just the composer should make moves in that structural pattern and on the same time on the intuitional, on the sense. And if they connect successfully, then the piece is successful. Yeah, but it's actually the sacred question, I think. Yes, if I have an answer to this, I will be I know I'll be very famous already.
Okay, are there any other questions?
Yes, please, maybe I can ask just a quick question.
Yes, Viltė?
Yes, I'm just thinking you are familiar with a figure-eight score, but maybe you try to write, for example, figure-eight poetry, because as we saw, the principles are quite similar. So I'm just interested.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I'm very interested in figure-eight poetry, but I must admit that I'm not good at literature. So maybe not enough mature to make something in this field. Maybe sometime I'll try. I'll dare.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any questions more?
I'd like to say something which is neither a question nor a comment, apart from being very much interested in what you have said. I mean, it's really revealing various possibilities. I mean, if a visual score can be many different things, just for, you know, as a visual impression, or something which really reflects something about structure or extra musical content, or analogy with another type of art like poetry. But I was actually going to make a suggestion. Are you familiar with REDIM? Recherche Internationale de Communauté Musicale, the organization which is involved in music iconography in various ways in which music and the visual correspond.
Could you repeat once more?
It's known by acronym REDIM. And it's basically Recherche International Research Group for Musical Iconography.
Thank you, it is wonderful. I haven't heard it, and I'll search definitely.
They do have their conference. I mean, 2 years ago there was in Tasmania, and this year was in Lucerne, and next year will be in Prague. That might be, this sort of thing might be an interesting presentation for them. So just have that in mind. I think that might be interesting in that.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. I think that Martins Willems had raised the hand for a question. Is that...
Okay, sorry. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I just wanted to ask a small question. How do you find it's important for you to perceive these figurative forms when you are listening that kind of music? Or just it is like a composing process which is important for you as a creative way to express your thoughts, or it is also very relevant thing when we are listening to that music, when we are able to perceive it or not?
Yeah, thank you. It's a very important question, because we kaip yra suvokti? Yes, sorry. We perceive the piece not during the listening, but also it remains in our memory. And for me, maybe during the listening process, the figurative score is not the priority, but in the whole understanding of what happens in that piece, the three maybe patterns connect: the sounding result, the figurative score, and the symbolic poetic maybe idea.
So it's important to keep in mind all these dimensions together. This is not only about listening to music, but also to understand the whole context of it, yes?
Yes, the context helps sometimes to understand. Yes, I think it's always worthy to listen to read annotations, to look at the scores of various pieces, not only figurative, but to understand that idea deeper, not only emotional.
In that case, there is a challenge for a composer, how one could grant that possibility for listeners to get that visual information aside that sounding materials. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, we have a question from Andrius. Oh, no?
It's not a question, it's kind of an answer to Martins, a comment to Martins. It's actually similar to what we in literature have, like two different terms, like soft world building and hard world building. It's very important in science fiction. Like hard world building, it's like reading the Lord of the Rings, where you have all the lore that is very important, like how the world functions, all the economy, all the races, all the political interactions. You have to know this in order to understand the book or the movie. And there's like soft world building, where it's like Hayao Miyazaki movies, where everything happens in front of the main protagonists, and you don't have to have very strict rules to experience the world. So this kind of figurative music is kind of a hard world building, where you have to know all the rules before you listen to it.
It's a wonderful comparison. Thank you. I'll keep it in mind.
Thank you very much, Andrius. So if there are no questions left, we have something more? Okay, something more from online. Yes, please. Arthur?
Yes,
Arthur, okay.
I'm back, I'm back.
Yeah, quickly, this is not my area, but I think I'm reacting appropriately when I see these scores and I think to myself immediately, I wonder what it sounds like. So there's a dichotomy there. I thought to myself, how are figurate composers open to the presentation of their scores as artworks? Would you be willing to, if a gallery said, well, we like the looks of this, we'd like to make an installation of scores? And would you say, well, there must be music in the room? Or if there was, is silence also appropriate? And so it's a simple question. How do you feel about the purely visual? Which in my case, as I say, I think to myself immediately, what does it sound like? But that might not be a general public reaction. Would you be open to a gallery saying, let's put a show on?
Thank you for the comment and question. Actually, it depends on the person who looks at that and on the aim, what the person is ready to find in this piece, or it's only maybe pictorial score and you're just imagining how it sounds, or you desperately need to hear the result. And in my opinion, actually, it is not only, the picture is not the svarbiausias, the most important thing, but maybe it is equal to the musical result. So sadly today I had not enough time to show more musical examples for the last piece. I have prepared the icon to play, but yeah, I understand your question very well. Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. If there's no question left, I think we are ready to end the first session for today and go for the coffee break. And
Thank
we'll
you
be
once
back at, I think, is that 12 o'clock? Okay. So thank you very much for joining us today. Goodbye.
Hello, is the sound okay?
Yes, we hear you.
Yes, it does. Welcome, Kayong.
Hello, thanks for having me.
We can't see you.
Oh,
You see your
is that,
face? Oh, yeah, just the screen.
I did share the video. Should I stop share for the moment?
Yes.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi. So should I get started right away?
Yes, I think Miloš is not back yet. He should be
Okay.
our moderator. Oh, here he is.
I'm very much back.
Hello.
Okay, so are we ready?
Yeah.
In this case, welcome to the second part of the third session, featuring first the keynote speaker, Kayong Chan, who is from the Chinese University of Hong Kong, assistant professor, composer. I'll keep introduction very, very brief, so I think that's enough to introduce the keynote speaker with his paper From Constraints to Creativity, Musical Inventions Through the Cantonese Contour. Please take the floor.
Thank you, Miloš. Let me share the screen first. Okay. I hope you can see the presentation okay. All right, thank you so
Yes,
much
it's
for
all
having
fine.
me.
It's
Yeah,
fine.
that's great.
Okay.
Okay, that's good to know. Thanks so much for having me. It's a great honor to be here and be able to see so many colleagues around the world, even if it's virtual for me. I would love to visit Lithuania in person when it's possible, and I'm really excited to share with you my research and creative work here. In today's talk, I'll be speaking about how composers in Hong Kong turn constraints into creativity, focusing on the use of the Cantonese speech contour as a creative constraint in our music. I will show that Cantonese as a tonal language offers unique musical potential in different elements of music, including melody, harmony, texture, and orchestration. And I'll also be demonstrating how I see text as a creative engine, not only for vocal and choral works, but also instrumental works with hidden text and unsung melodies. Let me begin by explaining what the constraints are in Cantonese text setting. As you may know, Cantonese is a tonal language that uses 9 tones at 6 different pitch levels meanings. Here on the screen is a graph describing the relative pitch levels of all 9 tones, with 1 being the lowest and 5 being the highest. The first 6 tones alone covered all the 6 pitch levels in Cantonese. To give you an idea of the relative pitch levels, here are some examples. The set of numbers here fits right into all 9 tones of Cantonese.
3 9 4 0 5 2 7 8 6
If the playback is not working, just let me know. And the following example illustrates how the sound fun corresponds to characters of different meanings when it is spoken with a different linguistic tone.
Fun, 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 fut, fut, fut.
With these different tones, fun refers to divide, powder, teach, burn, diligent, portion, sudden, and for tone 9, Buddha. There is a sound for tone 8, but there isn't a match for an existing word. The entering tones 7, 8, and 9 change the consonant of the coda N in fun into an unreleased T while repeating the pitch levels of tones 1, 3, and 6. Also musically relevant here is that tone 2 and 5 are rising tones that have an inherent upward glissando from a lower pitch. Even when the upward scope is not notated in the score, native Cantonese performers would automatically add them in the melody to avoid misunderstanding, hence creating a distinctive melodic feature of Cantonese vocal music. The key idea here is that in a tonal language like Cantonese, the same sound would mean very different things when it's pronounced with a different pitch contour. Since the same sound may carry vastly different or even conflicting meanings at different pitch levels, the perception of pitches as high or low in a melody fundamentally affects the perception of the corresponding text. Adjacent combinations of 2 or more Chinese characters complicate the text setting issue in that a word or phrase consisting of 2 or more characters is only meaningful when it is sung with the correct relative contour. For example, a combination of high-level tone 1 and low-level tone 4, as in fu tang, worded vines, creates a falling contour that should be matched to a falling musical interval. In reverse, a combination of the low-level tone 4 with the high-level tone 2, as in lao sui, flowing water, creates a rising contour that should be matched to a rising musical interval. The musical intervals also have to be at an appropriate distance so that the listener can perceive the intended meaning. If fu tang is set to an interval that is lexically misleading, such as a descending major third, like fu tang, a unison interval, like fu tang, or a reversed interval, such as an ascending major second, fu tang, the word would be unintelligible to the listener because the sound would be matched to other tones. This linguistic property of Cantonese makes it especially challenging for composers to set pre-existing Cantonese speech or text to music. In summary, if Cantonese lyrics are to be understood correctly in the melody, at least 2 conditions have to be fulfilled. The direction of the musical intervals has to match the lexical contour of the tone successions at different pitch levels, and the interval must be of an optimal distance. Otherwise, the interval would render the lyrics incomprehensible, if not lead to grave misunderstanding. For example, my lord, 举, could be perceived as pig, 居, and school principal, 好整, could be perceived as flirty elephant, 好整. This phenomenon, also known as those mismatched words, is painstakingly avoided in the composition of Cantonese lyrics if they are written after the music, so that the appreciation of the text will not be compromised. An important part of my research is to find out the optimal distances between each tone succession, because it is an area that has not been addressed sufficiently by the existing literature. To achieve this goal, I have conducted a series of perception tests. The participants are asked to listen to music intervals ranging from a unison to a ninth and identify which are the intelligible ones for each Cantonese tone combination, meaning that they can understand the word when it is sung in a particular interval. The results so far show that intelligibility of musical intervals are not so clear-cut. For each tone combination, different participants may find different sets of intervals intelligible. In other words, the intelligibility of the intervals is a much more fluid concept than the current understanding. Expectedly, there are intervals that are 100% intelligible, and those will be intervals closest to the distance between the tones in natural speech. Conversely, there are also intervals that none of the participants find intelligible. Yet there is also a gradation of intelligibility between the two ends, containing intervals that varying percentages of participants would find intelligible. This research data is expected to help composers better navigate the process of musical text setting in Cantonese, and they will know with more certainty which intervals are likely to lead to a correct understanding of the text and which other intervals would be riskier. While the data set has not been published yet, it's my first time presenting my results. I have summarized part of my findings on my research website so that composers may look up which intervals are considered intelligible by at least 75% of the participants. If you're interested, we can discuss more of this. And more importantly, these results are going to help provide a basis for my analysis of Cantonese work and study how composers turn constraint into creativity. The project has allowed me to develop the following resources for the musical community and the public. The first one is the prototype of a Cantonese melody generator. Anyone who enters a Chinese phrase will be able to generate an intelligible Cantonese melody, or more precisely, a pitch succession that composers can work with to create an intelligible melody from a text. I hope this web application would make Cantonese text setting much more accessible to Cantonese speakers and even to non-speakers. Here's a demonstration of the prototype, and you can find it on the research website as well. As demonstrated in the above, treating two characters properly in a text setting creates enough trouble. When we're talking about a musical setting for an entire poem or a religious passage like a psalm, it presents an enormous challenge for composers to create melodies that could fit the tonal contour of the language and still be musically interesting and aesthetically satisfying. Because of such constraints, writing music that maintains intelligibility in Cantonese is particularly challenging, even for composers who are native speakers. However, my proposition is precisely that these constraints can act as a most potent source for musical innovation. For illustration in this talk, I have chosen 3 pieces of contrasting lineup and styles, including a work for choir and ensemble by Hingen Chan, a Chinese orchestral piece by Doming Lam, and an orchestral piece of my own. I will begin the discussion with choral writing. This is an important area to address because the text setting constraints and other performance challenges have historically hindered the development of the genre. Although Hong Kong has a robust choral music scene comprising choruses of all age groups that have been performing locally and internationally since the 1950s, the Cantonese choral repertoire, be it sacred or secular, remains very small compared to works in other languages. Prior to the handover of Hong Kong in 1997, most local composers wrote pieces in English or Mandarin. To date, no more than 300 original Cantonese choral works are in publication, and many of those works have only a single melodic line, hence avoiding the challenge of writing intelligible lines for choral textures. In addition to that, compositions that successfully balance musicality and textual intelligibility are especially rare. The work I've discovered so far are compiled into a growing database of choral works in Cantonese. I have over 150 works by now, and its job is to help conductors around the world discover these rare works and composers. And the existing works can be divided into 2 categories depending on how composers deal with the issue of intelligibility for multiple voice parts. The first category, which is an easier way out for many, is to compose an intelligible line for the foreground melody while disregarding the intelligibility of the supporting voices. Most of the Cantonese choral works fall into this first category. The melody is usually placed in the highest voice part and often harmonized by homorhythmic accompaniment in other voices. The accompanying voices would sing the same sound components of the words, but the result for these non-foreground voices would be mostly, if not entirely, unintelligible because of the disagreement between the melodic and the lexical contour. This is often an amusing, if not frustrating or agonizing experience for the lower and inner voices because they will have to sing nonsense throughout the piece. While the overall effect will be intelligible for the audience, this mode of composition limits the possibilities of counterpoint and other musical interests. Another category of work emerged in the recent decade. There is a small group of composers who endeavored to write Cantonese choral works that ensure all voice parts have intelligible melodies. These composers were eager to create contrapuntal and harmonic interests for all voice parts. Even the contour of the melodies were predetermined by the textual contour. Some common strategies include using varying intelligible intervals in parallel contours, setting the same text to different rhythms across the voice parts, displacing entries of the same text, staggered paddle of individual characters, as well as melismatic writing. I will use Heng Chen's work as an example because it integrated most of these strategies in a single work. His piece, titled A Poet's Four Seasons, is a four-movement choral piece scored for SATB mixed choir and a Chinese instrument ensemble. Each of the movements are set to lyric poems by Song Dynasty poet Xin Qiji from the 9th century. Let us first hear the excerpt to be discussed. Now let's take a closer look at the text setting strategies. Since the text comes before the music, the melodies must follow the lexical contour and optimal interval suggested by the text. To create musical interest within the constraints, the first of the strategies is to use varying intelligible intervals for the melody despite the parallel contour. The entry of the line 兩三點雨山前, 2 or 3 drops of rain on the hill, are assigned to the tenor parts. The 2 lines start on different pitches and unfolded with different intervallic structures. Here's the phrase in natural speech.
兩三點雨山前.
And here are the 2 intelligible versions of the melody. As you can hear, toward the end of the phrases, different intervals are used between the characters rain and hill, with the ascending major second and major third matching to the 5-1 tone succession. The same strategy was applied to the musical setting of San, hill, and its succeeding character Qin, front, in which the descending minor 7th and major 6 matches the 1-4 tone succession. The result is a harmonized line of text that remains intelligible without having to move in fixed parallel intervals throughout the phrase, which would have sacrificed independence of the vocal lines. The latter 2 characters, which form a semantic unit, San Qin on the hill, were accepted and echoed by the bass part starting on 2 other pitches, both of which descended an intelligible major 6 from San to Qin. The soprano and alto voices also echoed the same words with different rhythmic values and harmonies. The next phrase, Thatched in next to the village god's house illustrates two other common strategies to create harmonic and contrapuntal motion that include displaced entry of the same line, displayed here, as well as varying rhythms of the same text towards the end of the phrase. These strategies show how contrapuntal writing and harmonic interest can be achieved in a Cantonese setting, even though the direction of the melodic line was constrained by the lexical contour of the text. The next phrase demonstrates how the composer creates harmonies from the text by introducing staggered entries of sustained notes that sings individual characters from intelligible semantic units. This example from rehearsal number 4 shows a recurrence of the motif bright moon, 明月, and cool wind, 清风. Collectively, these 4 characters form a phrase that can be considered intelligible, and it is typically performed by one's voice part. Yet in Hengyan's setting, each of these characters are assigned to different voice parts. The basses perform the motive bright moon, beginning on the same note G flat for bride, but they move to the second character moon through different intelligible intervals for the 4/6 tone succession, thus arriving at a dyad of A flat and B flat. As the bass part sustained the notes on the character moon, the tenor parts entered with the first character cool with D flat and E flat, a minor third and perfect fourth away from the top note of moon. Both of these intervals are considered optimal for the succession from tone 6 to 1. The tenors then sustained the dyads above the basses, forming interlocking perfect fourths a major second apart, a sonority to be picked up and developed by other parts. The same pitches of the top voices are echoed by the solo pipa, which harmonized the last note with a dissonant chord using 3 of its open strings. The repetition of the motivic materials in the instrumental part is also a strategy to foster coherence in Cantonese works, since the melodic contour of a text may not have recurring ideas throughout. Let's hear this bit again. And although these techniques are commonly found in choral works in non-tonal languages, they are distinctive in the Cantonese repertoire in the sense that they allow the constrained melodic writing to become a source of creativity. By writing melodies and harmonies within the intelligible confines of the text, composers may be led to musical languages that may not have existed in the current vocabularies. In other words, the text setting constraint can be seen as an algorithmic procedure to help composers find musical possibilities that might not have been discoverable in otherwise unconstrained situations. To follow up on this idea, I will show an instrumental work in which extended passages are composed from one short speech phrase containing only 3 characters. This work is Doming Lam's Autumn Execution, written in 1978 for an orchestra of Chinese instruments, also known as a Chinese orchestra. It is not only a landmark piece that became the cornerstone in symphonic writing for Chinese instrument, but also the earliest example in Hong Kong contemporary music, showing that develops musical materials in an instrumental work using linguistic contours of unsung text. This work explicitly required the musicians imitate on their instruments the speech and theoretical styles of the text written in the score, although the text is unknown to the audience. The piece was inspired by Dou Yuan, a 13th century Chinese play written by Yuan Dynasty author Wan Hanqing. The passage in question can be found in the 3rd movement titled Chapter 3, The Cry of Injustice, Heaven and Earth Are Shocked. The extra musical narrative depicts the protagonist Douhe being taken to her execution because she was wrongly convicted for murdering her father. In Lam's depiction of this scene, the protagonist would repeatedly and desperately exclaim injustice, or yun wang in Cantonese, a three-character phrase whose lexical contour was taken by Lam and transformed into the motive for this movement. The resultant motive closely resembles the natural speech contour, in which each tone is separated by roughly a major second.
冤枉啊！
This initial idea was then reconstructed into a longer phrase, with each component requiring a different expressive quality as indicated by the punctuation, as well as the truncation of the tone particle ah. The resultant phrase now comprises 3 hidden cries of injustice. In the music, it was first introduced by a solo 2-stringed fiddle called Lei Qing, whose vocal quality made it particularly eerie. The varied use of wide vibrato along with the glissandi would aptly bring out the nuanced emotional content of the phrases. Other string instruments would join in one by one, as instructed by the conductor. A solo wind instrument, Heidi, would make a brief appearance before the piece comes to its improvised section. It is also worth noting that the second character, Wang, is a rising tone with an upward glide in natural speech. If the glide is missing, the word would not be intelligible. Therefore, even though the glide was not written in the score, the Hong Kong musicians who understood the tones of the text have added in the glissando in the performance so that it could more closely resemble the hidden speech. Let's hear a short excerpt of the phrase first entry and see if you can catch that added glide. I hope you could catch the upward glide in the second character, which is quite an important feature of Cantonese melodic writing. In the aleatoric section, some of the entries would disrupt the whole tone descending pattern by replacing one of the whole steps by a half step. The phrase, if sung, would still remain intelligible with this adjustment. As the imitative texture thickens, the harmony grows increasingly dissonant. The overall effect of the aleatoric passage is a sound mass superimposing a whole tone collection and a secondo pentachord. Let's just listen to this excerpt and see how one single phrase has grown into a large section. Okay, I'm not sure if the music sound a little bit soft to you. It sounds a little bit soft on my side, but if you can hear it clearly, then it's fine. If it's too soft, let me know in the text box and I will see if I can fix it in the presentation. As demonstrated in the excerpt, the passage of controlled improvisation was abruptly dominated at rehearsal number 2 by a rhythmic polytonal passage where regular pulse is first introduced in this movement. The descending motive is now transposed and imitated at various rhythmic values. The motive is highlighted by groups of plucked strings instruments and wind instruments whose timbre has yet to be featured. As the piece builds up towards its climactic ending, the wind instruments would pair up with the higher strings and shift to perform homorhythmic and polytonal renditions of the motive. It alternates with groups of gongs arranged in high, medium, and low pitches, which was an abstraction of the 3-note speech motive as well. These two foreground elements are placed against the rhythmic drive of 16th notes in the plucked strings and lower strings, which are also derived from the speech motive. This brief example shows how the lexical contour from a single short phrase has germinated melodic and harmonic ideas in an orchestral context, at the same time effectively pointing to extra musical narratives through its timbral expression. The lack of a sung or narrated text befittingly conveys the poetics of the protagonist struggling to communicate the injustice of her case and never succeeding. Through this example, we can see how melodic phrases are constructed based on the contour of the words, how the phrase is varied within the intelligible intervals, and how its superimposition in an orchestral context creates interesting harmonies and textures, and how the emotional content of the phrase has informed the timbral expressions of the instrument. The next example, which is a work of my own, will bring us back to the familiar sound world of the Western orchestra, and we will see how Cantonese text setting can become a creative engine in other musical realms. The piece is titled Times of Prospering and Perishing, and it is written 40 years after Doming Lam's work. It was written as a response to an incident where the Hong Kong government has cut down 4 century-old banyan trees, which have been an important collective memory for generations of Hong Kongers. And with this as a starting point, I wanted to explore in my work how I can express different phenomena of prospering and perishing with musical means. In contrast to Doming Lam's work, which used only a 3-character phrase, I created my musical materials using 2 ancient Chinese poems. The longer length of the text created substantially more constraining text-setting challenges, but also opened up more opportunities. The creative process began with the composition of contrasting thematic groups through the lexical contour of these poems. My goal is to create melodies that would have been understood if these poems were sung in Cantonese. At the same time, these melodies should also be dynamic and musically interesting so that it would not be merely an imitation of natural speech contour. The thematic materials of the prospering section is designed based on an excerpt from Farewells on Grassland, an 8th century poem by Tang Dynasty poet Ba Geyi. And the materials of perishing are derived from the contour of a 13th century poem, Autumn Thoughts by Yuan Dynasty poet Ma Ziyun. This presentation will focus only on the perishing section because it can demonstrate approaches of harnessing the constraints that are more distinct from those of Hing and Chan and Doming Lam. The graph here shows the organization of the work. As we can see, fragments of prospering material set up the stage before the full statement of the prospering theme. Throughout this prospering section, there will also be perishing materials lurking in the background, foreshadowing the later sections. After the piece arrives at its first local climax, fragments of perishing materials will take over forcibly and eventually build up the tension again in a new harmonic language toward the climax of the whole piece, which contains the full statement of the perishing theme. Finally, The fragments of prospering and perishing would juxtapose in the ending of the piece, as if leaving behind unanswered questions. Will we continue to perish, or will we prosper again? Are the two inextricably linked with one another, or are they one and the same? These are the extra musical questions posed by the work. And here is the poem from which materials for the perishing section are generated. At this point of the work, the audience would experience a stark change of atmosphere from the hopeful to the devastated. This text was chosen because it fittingly depicts the sense of desolation that I wish to convey as part of the piece. The English version is as follows. Wooded vines, ancient trees, crows cawing at dusk, adorn a narrow bridge of flowing stream and homesteads about. On the old path in westerly wind stands a bony horse. The setting sun in the west leaves behind the heart-wrenched at the end of the world. The Cantonese contour of this poem has given rise to several melodic phrases. I will use the first two phrases as a demonstration.
枯藤老樹昏鴉，枯藤老樹昏鴉，小橋流水人家，小橋流水人家。
Once again in here, the upward inflections in characters with tone 2 and 5, such as old, low, and water, 水, are reflected by the upward glissandi. These ornaments not only give the melody a distinctive Cantonese flavor, but also help Cantonese-speaking audiences to trace the hidden text if they choose to listen intently for it. Beyond creating this initial version of the full film, I have used the contours as a basis of variation. In other words, the same text and contour are used to create different variations of intelligible melodies that could also be understood when they are sung in Cantonese. The following example shows three versions of the first line of the poem, 枯藤老樹昏鴉, wooded vines, ancient trees, crows cawing at dusk.
枯藤老樹昏鴉，枯藤老樹昏鴉，枯藤老樹昏鴉。
This procedure of creating variation through maintaining textual intelligibility of the melodies was useful in creating coherent sounding new melodies with different intervallic structures that are refreshing to listen to, but still familiar to the audience. These phrases would then be scattered around the piece in various forms. For instance, these phrases will combine in counterpoint at the climactic moment of the piece. Musically, it is an emotionally charged 2T section that includes the only complete statement of the perishing theme. The first line, 枯藤老樹昏鴉, comes in the following versions here. These phrases are either juxtaposed or superimposed in a heterophonic manner, which means the audience will hear the variation simultaneously, in direct succession, or overlapped with one another. The text also informs the orchestration decision of the passage, in that the progression or change of timbre is linked to the individual phrases or the smaller semantic units within the phrase. For instance, the first two characters, 枯藤, wooded vines, was orchestrated by oboe, clarinet, and first violins. The rest of the phrase, 老樹昏鴉, ancient trees and crows in the dusk, was orchestrated by oboe, trombone, and first violin. A second phrase, narrow bridge, flowing streams and homestead about, was played by the oboe and clarinet. And the first phrase would then restart with 枯藤, or wooded vines, orchestrated with yet another combination, flute and first violins. In other words, the hidden text of this piece has contributed not only to the creation of motive, but also to the progression and changes in orchestral timbre. These processes of juxtaposed contour and word-based orchestration is the creative basis throughout this climactic section. To illustrate the process, here are the phrases marked with the orchestration and the corresponding hidden text. Let's listen to this part together. And this would conclude my discussion of the perishing materials and its text setting approaches. I hope this excerpt from the work is illustrative of my intentions. By now, the constraint of Cantonese text setting has been turned into creative potential across different musical parameters. The approaches include creating melodies and motives based on the contour and semantic units, variations of phrases based on the lexical contour, orchestration based on the semantic units, as well as putting the contours and fragments in counterpoint. In other parts of the piece, the same approaches would also help organize harmonic materials. Some of these approaches are subtler and more subdued, with the text-based thematic material being faintly suggested in the background, while others are more prominent and hence would be easier for a Cantonese-speaking audience to pick up as they listen to the work. I hope the introduction of the three contrasting works by Hing Chan, Doming Lam, and myself can offer a glimpse into what is at work in some of Hong Kong composers' creative processes. To round up, I would like to share my thoughts regarding the current and future development of the contemporary Cantonese repertoire. The recent years has seen works incorporating Cantonese texts growing in numbers. For instance, contemporary opera sung in Cantonese is new territory that emerged in the last 5 years. This form of opera in Cantonese should be distinguished from the traditional Cantonese opera, or heiko, which was a direct descendant of the Chinese theatrical arts. These new contemporary operas are conceived instead as a contemporary rendition of the Western classical operatic tradition that is performed in Cantonese. To date, less than 3 of these operas are in existence. There is also a growth in Cantonese choral works in recent years, and a lot of them are written by younger composers, many of which are born after the handover of Hong Kong in 1997. Also steadily growing in numbers are instrumental works with hidden Cantonese text. Some composers do it as a kind of cultural assimilation. For example, Chan Ming-chi's recent work for Chinese orchestra titled Tale of the Mahjong Heroes derived its musical elements from phrases used during games of Mahjong, a popular tile-based game in southern China. More recently, there are also composers who hid political messages in their works in view of the heightening censorship in all genres of arts in Hong Kong. In terms of impact, this recent surge of Cantonese language-inspired compositions will be an important effort to keep Hong Kong's language alive by including them in as many contemporary art forms as possible, especially in art forms that tell contemporary narratives. Collectively, They emphasize the artistic value of the Cantonese language and how it realizes the hidden musicality in classical and contemporary Chinese literature, daily speeches, and other textual genres. As such, this body of work offers a pathway for foreign, if not other Chinese audiences to get to know the language, cultures, and narratives embedded within the arts. In closing, I would like to share with you a quote from Stravinsky. My freedom will be so much the greater and more meaningful the more narrowly I limit my field of action and the more I surround myself with obstacles. The more constraints one imposes, the more one frees oneself of the chains that shackle the spirit. In different aspects of our work and life, constraints can become the most powerful creative engine. Problems can become the greatest potentialities. The work I showed you today is an illustration of how just one constraint can be channeled into different forms of creativity. There are many others that are left to be explored and many others that ought to be explored. Thank you very much indeed. And I'll be happy to take questions.
Well, thank you very much. That was really fascinating and revealing. I don't think there are too many experts on Cantonese, whether language or music in this audience. So I really think that we ought to be thankful to hearing something like that. Now I invite questions and comments. We have actually plenty of time, about 10 minutes before the next talk is scheduled.
Okay, so I would like to ask a question. You presented us with beautiful choral settings of, well, rather contemporary choral settings. And I have a question, how about Cantonese folk music? Is there a precedent for like a multi-voice setting in a Cantonese language? Like multi-voice choral music which is like not professional music?
Well, thank you for the question. In Cantonese folk music, there are mostly, well, those that I know of are monophonic. So there isn't a tradition in Cantonese folk music, sung folk music, to sing in multiple voice parts. Those that feature multiple voice part would be Cantonese popular music. You will hear backing vocals that have harmonized the leading melodic line, but the backing vocals would not be intelligible. So it's very much like the case that I presented earlier with an intelligible foreground melody, but mostly unintelligible background. Still, the result would be intelligible as long as the foreground and background is clearly distinguished.
So that presents more challenges for the composers, the lack of tradition.
Yeah, it is very challenging. So composing music from the text has always been very challenging for Cantonese composers. So another way to do it is to write the music first and then ask the lyricist to take up the challenge of writing intelligible lyrics.
That's one way to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, from the Western perspective, that would be a very unusual sequence of actions. It's in my mind, it's always much easier to set words to music than vice versa.
Yeah, it's a very different approach when there is a lexical contour constraint. But I also find that fascinating because it presents me with a lot of opportunities to work with the constraints and create materials that are unique to that constraint.
And how likely to get to this question of music without explicitly stated text, but perhaps a hidden text, how likely is a Cantonese speaker be to identify words behind that music? In European languages, it is practically, I mean, we have various ways of conveying text, but we don't have tone languages, so it's really usually unintelligible for the listener unless he or she knows the text, actually.
Well, thanks for the question. Yeah, this is a really great question. So there are, well, for those pieces that I know, there are different ways to convey the text. Some of them are explicitly written in the program so that the audience can try to trace the text as they listen to the music. And some of them, as I mentioned, are hidden political messages so that people who share the same experience would have some phrases in mind that could not be spoken, but that they may be heard through the music. I think some of the younger composers have done that, and I can indeed discover what they have hidden in the music. So I think it depends on the common live experience of the audience as well, whether they have a common experience with the composer. If they hear those things, if they have heard those things in live, then it's possible for them to figure out what is being at work in the piece of music.
More questions?
I just have an observation that, tonal music and harmony is actually deeply rooted in speech patterns of European languages, especially German and others. And maybe it's not really feasible for the composers who are like native speakers of tonal language to adopt it in the first place. Maybe you should develop your own kind of musical patterns for contemporary music, and rather not stick with harmony, tonal harmony.
Yeah, thanks for the comment. That's certainly another way out, is to create new textures that would be unique to the language of Cantonese. But things have happened already, and so these are the things that have been developed so far, and maybe we will see a different direction in the future. And I'm optimistic that more and more interesting work will come out of the Cantonese language. Thanks for the comment.
Well, there's someone else. Someone wanted to say something?
No, it's just a thank you.
I was wondering, in European music, there's been various ways in which composers responded to the challenge of text. We know madrigalisms from the Renaissance, and then theory of effects in Baroque, and then particularly in French Baroque opera, conscious endeavors to shape music according to the reflections of the French language. But then we've had already quite a tradition in Europe of unintelligible text. The text which is broken down to syllables or to individual phonemes, in which is not meant to be understood. Are there any such developments in Cantonese music?
Thanks for the question. It's really great question, because if there was more time, I could explore more of that. Actually, for the unintelligible part, they do exist in some of the choral words, and they would be mostly put in the background of the intelligible line. So that is one of the approaches that is used by the composers. But I would like to mention another phenomenon in Hong Kong, that is the Cantonese worship music. Most of them are being translated by missionaries who did not know the tone rules very much. So a lot of Cantonese worship music and Christian worship music is complete nonsense, and it has been, and to this day, for many decades. And they has been a issue of mockery for many people who are not religious, even for the religious people. So that's why a lot of people tend to avoid unintelligible writing when composing for Cantonese melody, because it would be very funny for the general public, actually. And that's why it's so agonizing for the lower voices and inner voices to sing unintelligible lines, because they have such crazy meanings often.
Yeah, is there any, we have time for a quick one, if someone else has something to add. I would have much more to discuss, but we have to move on. So thank you very much. And now I'm about to introduce Jurgis Palauka from the Lithuanian Academy of Music, and he studied composition and musicology, and currently a PhD candidate in musicology. His paper is titled "Manifestations of Intrinsic Musical Form in Onu Tenor String Quartet." I'm sorry, it's a bit tongue breaking, but please, Jurgis, take the floor.
Okay, so 1 second and I will proceed. So where is... Okay, so 1 second, where's my USB? No, it doesn't see it. Huh? No. Okay, 1 second. Okay. Va, andiamo, puikiai. Ok, tai aš turiu pasidalinti. Okay.
Pasidalinai?
Ne, nepasidalinau. Jeigu... Matosi? Reikia, kad aš matyčiausi?
Tiesiog share screen.
Okay.
Palauk, tavęs šito nesimato. Share screen.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't work with Zoom. Mostly we work with Microsoft Teams, so it's always hard, you know, to know everything. Okay, so let's start. I'm very happy to be able to present my presentation here. So 1 second, and we can move on. Okay, 1 second. So okay. Okay, so we can start. So the form of contemporary music works is very individual. So as Dora Haninen observes, such individuality in music form, whether or of individual passages or entire compositions, is especially common in contemporary music, where form tends to evaporate as a distinct concept, becoming synonymous with the music itself as a continuous connection of significant detail, motions, and gestures. So the forms of these contemporary music works have little resemblance to classical musical forms, It is because in these works the composers do not use classical forming techniques such as tonality, theme, or cadence that complicates the division of the work into smaller structural parts. But even if it is possible to divide a work into smaller parts, these parts no longer perform functions such as exposition, development, or reprise, or the boundaries between the functions performed by these sections are becoming blurred. All this makes the analysis of the form of these contemporary music works problematic, particularly in terms of the criteria by which these works can be divided into smaller structural units. Okay, 1 second. Okay. By presenting an analysis of the form of Onutė Narbutaitė's string quartet called Just Strings and a Light Wind About Them, this presentation aims to suggest one possible option for analyzing the form of such and similar musical works. Usually music analysis based on small musical elements or entities such as motive, pitch class sets, and etc. are based on the analysis of small musical fragments, but because this presentation aims to analyze the form, it presents analysis of complete work of Narbutaitė's string quartet. And Hänninen calls it holistic analysis. Okay, so first I would like to present some ideas, Hänninen thoughts of the theory of form. So Hänninen in her articles develops the idea of form, which she terms intrinsic musical form. Before defining what this term means, I want to mention that she is not developing an entirely new theory of form. She continues to view form as showing how the musical material has been organized in a given work, and she believes that both classical and contemporary music forms are organized in a similar way. What makes her approach new is that she proposes to look at the form from a different point of view. So she outlines two possible ways of looking at a form. The first approach relates to her idea of intrinsic musical form. In this case, the analysis of form must begin by looking at the musical work from the bottom up. This would mean that the analysis must begin with analysis of the musical material, or as she puts it, the content of the musical work, rather than looking for manifestations of a pre-known form in the work. She states that intrinsic musical form explicitly identifies form with content, content being the totality of segments and associative sets heard in a particular context based on sonic disjunctions and potential for contextual association. The second approach to form is found when a music work is viewed from the top down, for example, by knowing or assuming the form of music work in advance. As Hänninen observes, the way in which a music work is organized is referred to by a single term, such as sonata form, and we immediately know what form it will be. So the first approach to the form of music work can also be applied to analysis of classical forms, but this approach is more applicable to contemporary music works because their forms are individual and therefore do not have predetermined or predefined forms. To look at the music work from the bottom up is to start analysis from the content. And for Hänninen, content is the musical material, the small musical formations, and the associations between them. The form of the work then becomes a reflection of the network of association between these segments, as well as a reflection of totality of events in the work. So this approach to the form of work of music is dependent on a compositional technique used in a work. For example, if dodecaphony has been used in a musical work, then the section of the form will be determined by the repetition of the series, the introduction of the new series, or other tools of the dodecaphonic technique. So also Hänninen suggests that not to go to extremes in the analysis of form. So if we look at the work from the top down, then the extreme of such an approach would be in the form of the named forms. And if you look at it from the bottom up, then the evaporation into details. Thus, while music material is important to the form of work, it, according to Hänninen, must not be be reduced to details. And this is the citation of, so form is neither separated from details nor reduced to a collection of them. The form appears together with a set of sound events, connection and associations perceived in a given context. Thus, form develops from the bottom up to emerge as a concept that organizes the whole, in which detail is perceived in relation to patterns, cutoffs, and continuity. Her approach to musical form is heavily influenced by the German composer Stefan Wolpe's thoughts on musical form. He associates form not with musical events, but with relationships between these events. And he also states that there is no theology in a work of music, so no directionality. According to him, in a work, the musical events are, as it were, juxtaposed or aligned. And also very important that Hänninen points out that the analysis of the form is at the same time the interpretation of the work, and that the musical form is therefore flexible, depending very much on which segments and which associations have been focused on in the process of analysis. She bases this approach on the fact that when listening to music, the form, and this is the citation, may be highly flexible among different listeners, depending upon which particular association are attended to and how these are organized. Okay, so because the theoretical basis for this presentation is the theory, analysis method, and terminology formulated by Dora Hänninen, I will briefly introduce the key terms and their meanings. So musical entities are called using term segments in this presentation. So segments can be associated into categories which are called or will be called associative sets. So associative, okay. Oh, maybe I can shift this for you to be able to see what is written. Okay. So an associative set must have at least two members, and this is an quotation. These are interrelated by one or more contextual criteria. Individual members of the set can be supported by different set of contextual criteria, and conversely, every contextual criterion shown to contribute to the set must support at least two of its segments. An associative set may have any number of segments, and the segments one includes are a matter of analytic interpretation. Associative sets can form associative subsets. And an associative subset is, and this is a quotation, is a set of two or more segments embedded in a larger set and distinguished from its total membership by the action of additional, often stronger contextual criteria. Whether one models a certain group of segments as an associative set or an associative subset is a question of analytic interpretation. To show the relationship between segments, Hänninen proposes a contextual association graph. It's a visual expression of associative configuration or associative organization. And here is more explicit reference what is associative graph. So as an example of an associative set and subsets, I would like to briefly discuss the associative set A formed in the analysis of Onutė Narbutaitė string quartet. It looks like this. So as you can see, the associative set A, it's called using letters, which I want to present here consists of 39 segments, most of which are heard at the beginning of the work in the first two bars. The general criterion for this associative set were two structural elements of the segments. Firstly, their interval structure. Most of the segments are based on a pure fifth interval. The second criterion was the contour of the segments. A large number of segments are similar to each other in their interval structure, while those segments with a different interval structure can be linked to other segments by similarities in contour. So this associative set has been divided into three large subsets. called A1, A2, and A3, each of which is subdivided into smaller subsets, which can be divided into even smaller units, although Hänninen does not mention in her theory the possibility of dividing the subsets into even smaller units. In the present analysis, in order to highlight the internal similarities between the segments, some of the subsets have been subdivided into even smaller ones, and this is fully compatible with categorizational theory, where categorization takes place at several levels, from the very general to the very specific. So subsets are marked. Subsets are marked with squares in this analysis. And I want to present only one of these subsets. So this is the subset A1. So let's take a closer look at the first subset, A1. This subset is divided into 3 smaller units, and all of them are united by the similar interval structure. The basic structural interval is the pure fifth. The other unifying factor is the contour, and the first subset differs from the second by the way in which the segments are performed. Okay, so now I want to discuss a little bit analysis method. So I'd like to present the method used in this analysis. So the chosen string quartet of Biner-Butete was firstly divided into segments, and then these segments were grouped into 4 associative sets, A, B, C, and D, according to their similarity, which within each associative set, varying amounts of subsets were formed. According to the distribution of segments in the work of music, the later was divided into sections of different sizes. In the analysis, the most influential factor in determining the beginnings and the endings of the section was the change in the use of segments. The work has a homogeneous character, so segments belonging to 1 or 2 associative sets are usually used at the same time. So a change in the use of segments in 3 or 4, all 4 voices was interpreted as a sign of a change in the section. So this change in the use of segments can be caused by the introduction of new segments that have not been heard before, or by the exact or varied repetition of segments that have already been heard. In this quartet, segments belonging to 1 associative set are usually used for a limited amount of time. Then they are followed by appearance of segments belonging to another subset or another set. It is when such a change in the use of segments occurs in all voices, then it was interpreted as the formation of a new section. So let's take a closer look at these 2 variants of change, which illustrate the process of subdividing a music work into smaller parts or sections. So the example shows 2 sections, the first and the second. And this is the beginning of the quartet. So the black line marks the boundaries of the units of these sections, or structural units, I don't know how to call. As can be seen from the example, the first section contains only the segments belonging to the associative set A, while the second section contains only the segments belonging to the associative set B. In this case, the formation of the structural units is caused by the use of segments belonging to a new associative set. The second example, this looks like this, shows the end of the 10th section and the 11th section. So this is the end of the work. And in this case, the boundaries of the structural units are also defined by the changes due to the use of segments from different associative sets. So 11th section is formed because in all the voices, segments from associative sets are used, which because of their similarity to each other, also belong to 1 subset. Okay, so now I want to discuss briefly the structural features of this work in general. So I have divided the work into 11 sections of different lengths. The structural units are quite varied in length. The shortest section are about 1.5 and 2 bars long, and the longest division is more than 30 bars long. This long section could also be broken down into smaller sections, but this is often prevented by the fact that the more obvious endings only occur in 2 voices, and the other 2 voices do not have any clear ending signs. In such a case, the music material is not broken down into separate structural units. Such an example is found In the fourth section of the work, the structural unit begins with segments belonging to the associative set C. Then in the middle of the section, in the first and second violins, segments belonging to the associative set B and A are used, but in the viola and cello parts, segments belonging to the associative set C are sounding. So since segments belonging to associative sets A and B appear only in the first and second voices, a new section of the work has not been created. So the structure of this work is characterized by the fact that only the transition from the fifth and sixth section occurs immediately in all voices. Between several structural units, the transition takes place within a single measure. However, in most cases, the new section begins in one or two voices, and then the segments forming the new unit move on to other voices. It may take as many as 5 bars before the musical material of a new section is heard in all 4 voices of the work. An example of such a transition from one unit to another is found between the third and the fourth units. The segments belonging to the associative set C, which are characterized by a tertian structure, first appear in the second violin and viola parts. Then these segments are heard in the cello and finally in the first violin part. It takes 4.5 bars for the segments to appear in all 4 voices of the score. The musical material of individual sections also are organized in a very similar way. In the course of the work, new segments or new transformations of segments are continuously introduced into the musical material, initially appearing in 1 or 2 voices and then used in the other voices. Less frequently, segments that are new to existing musical context are used in only one voice. Usually they move from one voice to another. The musical material of the structural units in this work is quite homogeneous. Homogeneous because the units are often composed of segments belonging to 1 or 2 associative sets. Very often the smaller fragments of the movements or units contain only one segment belonging to one associative set, or even belonging to one subset. I would like to discuss function of these units very briefly, like 2-3 minutes, and that's all. I would in more detail below. So the first 4 sections, especially the first, second, and fourth, have an expositional function in the work. So the main international material of the work is first heard in them. Secondly, comparing these sections with the following ones, each of them is based on a dominant or dominated by segments from a single associative set. So the first unit being based on segments from associative set A, so this is the first section. The second on set B, so this looks like this. And the fourth on set C, so we have seen this one is transitional, so it can be, it's also the third section has a transitional function, and it's based on the segments belonging to associative set B, and this is the section 4, which is based more on associative set C. The middle sections, and especially the 8th, 9th, and 10th structural units, are characterized by more frequent segment changes. Often segments that have already been used are repeated exactly or in a transformed form. It's therefore possible to interpret these sections as having a developmental function. Such an interpretation may also be encouraged by the fact that in these units completely new segments, so not belonging to the previous associative sets, are not used. And the last section could be interpreted as a reprise, since its musical material is composed entirely of segments from the associative set A, like a first section which is also composed using only segments of associative set A. Okay. So by grounding the analysis of the works in small musical entities, it is possible not only to better understand the international structure of the work, but also the form. Changes in the distribution of segments in the musical material makes it possible to break the work down into smaller structural formations, and depending on which segments are used or how they are used, it opens up possibilities for interpreting what function particular section plays in a work of music. So this analysis method can certainly be applied to the analysis of the form of contemporary works, but probably only to those whom musical material is organized using such small musical entities. Okay, so thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Jurgis. Really very important questions for analysis. So please, let's hear comments, suggestions, questions.
I'm afraid there aren't any here at the audience. Oh, yeah?
Thank you for the presentation. I believe that after such a serious analysis, now you know by heart almost every note of this piece. But I have a question. As Onutė Narputaitė is a very kind and open person, have you showed or discussed your analysis with her? And if yes, what were her pastebėjimai, reflections maybe?
Okay, no, I haven't. Thank you very much for these questions. It's quite, it's a very good question, you know, because practically always there is some interpretation that this analysis has to show how the composer was thinking. But I wanted to, at the beginning, I wanted to how to say, do this accent on this, that this is a little more of interpretation, more of how I see this musical work, how I interpret it, but not how. But I don't want to reveal how the composer was composing the musical work. So it's more about interpretation of a musicologist, but not about this trying to understand. And not to understand, but trying to reveal maybe, or how to say, how composer composed the musical work. So my intention isn't like this. My intention is just to interpret it as how I see this musical work.
Okay, thank you. Maybe for another conference, it would be nice to listen to hear about the comparison of how you see and how the composer sees.
Yeah, because there are a lot of, you know, articles and where they try to, you know, do something like this. They how to say, analyze like these two views, like one view of how composer viewed the work, and the second how the musicologist like view this work. But maybe it's interesting, but you know, composers not always. I think that composers not always know what they do very clearly. You know, sometimes I think that a lot of this unconscious or something like this is involved into creational processes. So,
thank you very much.
I'm sorry, I just lost internet connection for a while, so. Yeah, that's a hazard when you work online. Anyhow, I'm sorry I missed something, but any other questions? Now I'm trying to remember what was I was trying to ask. How would this segmentation analysis relates to an older approach like Jean-Jacques Nattier, his paradigmatic analysis?
Oh, I'm not very good, you know, with this sort of analysis, but this is quite old, you know, like Schoenberg invented. Not even Schoenberg, even in the 19th century, I think it was invented, is because the roots of this sort of analysis in the motivic analysis that was, I don't know, 19th century, maybe, then Schoenberg proposed very much like try to do this connection between his music and the classical music. So he used also this motivic analysis, and it's still popular, as you can see. And why Hänninen? So Hänninen, I chose Hänninen because she created this framework, framework for this style of analysis. So we have all sorts of tools like segmentation tools, association tools, like categorization, form analysis tool, and etc. So there is like a big theory which has all, like a framework, which has all tools that can be used in this sort of analysis. But it's how to say, it's very, very related with this sort of analysis, of course, but now it's more influenced by the science. For example, science of categorization, so cognitive psychology. So a lot of things are taken from there and used in this analysis, for example, by trying to understand what elements are similar, how to define the similarity between elements or something like this. So this is not very similar to what Reti has done. You know, the Rudolf Reti, who says like this one is very similar to this one, so they are similar, so, and etc. So all the work is similar to the first bar or something like this. So now a lot of from categorization, this from cognitive psychology is used in how to say, to make this process a little bit more scientific process. But of course, on the other hand, Hänninen and others, they how to say, do this accent that this is just an interpretation, that this is not, this hard science, or how to say, but this is more of interpretation, that this, of course, there is some elements, scientific elements, for example, about how to segment, but even in this element of segmentation, you can see that there are a lot of possibilities. For example, if we would have an exercise to segment some example of this work, I think that all of us will segment it in different ways. Maybe not all of us, but we will have some like 3-4 possibilities, and all of them will look very good, very nice, according to the rules, and etc. and etc. So of course there are a lot of these subjectivities in this analysis. This is why this analysis is not so popular till these days. But this is interpreted as an interpretation. So we are doing science and interpretation at the same time.
Which would probably bring us, she also refers to Ruth Millikan and her philosophy, which is actually rather phenomenologically oriented. So that would perhaps be something also to explore.
Yeah, maybe.
Well, okay.
Okay.
Anybody else? Am I being heard?
No. We're out of questions here.
Yeah, we are.
Okay. So, as far as I understand, that's all for today.
Yes, it is. I'll have a few words to say for the closing. Thank you.
In this case,
thank you, Miloš. Thank you, Jurgis.
Thank you. We really.
It was really interesting to have an online moderator. It was quite unusual for the conference, but I think it worked really well. Thank you, Miloš. Yeah, and this is the end of today's session, and I would like to invite you to the concert at 7 p.m. in St. Casimir Church, where we will have some premieres by Lithuanian composers. Unfortunately, it won't be broadcasted online, and we will meet our online colleagues tomorrow at 10 a.m. and we will have a very special session, which will be performances, presentations. All the presenters will play live instruments and give some thoughts on what they are doing. It will be some new wins in our conference, and I will see you tomorrow. Thank you for being here. Goodbye.